In the burning deserts of North Africa, Italian tank crews went to war in machines that already belonged to another age. The M1340, boxy and riveted, rolled forward under the scorching sun as its crew peered through narrow slits, clutching their faith more tightly than their weapons. Against the British at first, it seemed adequate, slow but steady, armed with a 47 gun that could threaten a cruiser tank under the right conditions. But by the time they met the Americans and their Shermans, the Italians were driving relics into the storm of a mechanized century. At first glance, both sides looked similar olive-drab steel, hatches flung open, dust spiraling in the wake of convoys. Yet under the armor plates, the differences were night and day. The American M4 Sherman was a machine born not just from engineers, but from an entire industrial civilization geared for mass production and reliability. The M1340 was the product of a limited, struggling wartime economy, hastily riveted, underpowered, and poorly ventilated. The battlefields of 1942 told the truth brutally. At Gazala, at Bir el Gubai, and finally at El Alamein, Italian tankers faced an enemy that could fire, move, and survive in ways their own vehicles could not. The Sherman's 75 gun tore through their armor at ranges the Italian guns could barely dream of matching. When an Italian round did strike a Sherman, it often bounced harmlessly or cracked but didn't penetrate. The crews inside the M1340 knew this before they fired. They'd seen too many of their comrades' shells shatter on impact. Inside those thin steel coffins, 4 or 5 men worked in choking heat. The engine groaned, oil fumes filled the air, and the rivets that held the armor together could become lethal projectiles when hit. Every round incoming was a coin toss. Would the plate hold or would it peel open like paper? Many of the crews had little training in coordination, often fighting in scattered groups without radios. The Sherman crews, in contrast, operated with clear communication, standard tactics, and confidence in their machine. And yet the Italians fought. They fought because they had no choice, because pride and discipline still mattered, and because for all its faults, the M1340 was their home. But as they watched Shermans move across the desert, fast, stable, unflinching, they realized this was not a contest of courage anymore. It was a contest of technology and production, and one side had already lost before the battle began. When the first Shermans appeared in late 1942, Italian tankers reported them as invincible. Their shells seemed to vanish into the desert dust. Captured officers later confessed they couldn't believe how many Shermans kept arriving fresh, clean, standardized. For every tank the Axis repaired, the Allies built 50. The war had shifted from skill to scale, and the Italians, inside their aging machines, were simply being erased by progress. By the time the Shermans rolled into Tunisia, the Italian armored divisions were a shadow of their former selves. Mechanics scavenged parts from wrecks, welding together hybrids of broken machines just to keep a few rolling. Paint flaked, transmissions seized, and the desert wind found every weakness in their thin armor. The Americans, meanwhile, arrived with a logistical system unlike anything the Italians had ever witnessed, convoys of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts stretching from Algiers to the front. Every Sherman that broke down was replaced within days. Every Italian tank that broke down was gone for good. The men of Ariete Division and Littorio Division knew the odds, yet they kept fighting. Some tank commanders, veterans of earlier campaigns, could almost predict the moment their engine would overheat or their turret jam. They had learned to maneuver behind dunes, to take advantage of the terrain, to ambush if possible, but nothing could hide them for long from a Sherman's stabilized gun and radio coordination. The Americans advanced in columns, their air cover circling overhead, their artillery timed with clockwork precision. During one clash near Teberba, Italian crews watched as Shermans crested a ridge and opened fire in near-perfect unison. The first volley destroyed half a platoon. The survivors tried to reposition, but their tanks bogged in soft sand, engines whining helplessly. Those few who escaped the barrage retreated under smoke, only to be met by P-40 Warhawks strafing the road. For the Italians, there was no front line anymore, just survival from one hour to the next. Yet what truly struck them wasn't only the enemy's firepower. It was the sheer rhythm of American warfare, organized, impersonal, mechanical. The Shermans seemed to fight as extensions of a system, not as isolated acts of bravery. Every damaged tank was reported, retrieved, and replaced. The soldiers had cold rations and motor oil that arrived on time. Even the sandbags on their hulls were standardized, identical across units. The Italian soldiers, often hungry and undersupplied, began to realize that the Americans were fighting a war not just with men, but with mathematics. Captured Italian officers would later recall their shock at how calm American crews appeared in battle. They moved deliberately, not like men fighting for survival, but like engineers running a test. When an Italian round did penetrate a Sherman's armor, the Americans simply marked the hit, studied it, and adapted. Within months, newer Shermans rolled off ships with improved welding, thicker glacis plates, and even better transmissions. The Italians, stuck with factories bombed and resources drained, could do little more than hope their luck would hold for another engagement. By 1943, the illusion of parity was gone. The Italian tankers understood that bravery could no longer offset weakness in design. Their machines rattled and groaned toward another fight, each battle fought not to win, but to endure. And behind every Sherman barrel that flashed across the dunes, they saw the reflection of an industrial giant they could never match. When the Italian tankers were finally overrun and captured, many expected cruelty from their American foes. Instead, they encountered something else entirely, a system of efficiency wrapped in unexpected humanity. The prisoners were transported not to cages or desert pens, but to organized compounds, fed regularly, and assigned work details under clear rules. For men who had fought in crumbling machines and eaten rations half their weight in sand, this new order felt almost unreal. As their trucks rolled north through Allied supply lines, the captured tankers saw an empire of logistics in motion. Convoys of trucks stretched for miles, engines rumbling like a single organism. Fuel drums were stacked in neat rows, every crate labeled and logged. They watched maintenance crews working under floodlights, welding Sherman hulls and changing engines as though they were bicycles. What Italy built by hand, America replaced by system. The difference was staggering. When they finally arrived in the United States as prisoners of war, that difference became undeniable. At the ports, they saw Liberty ships docking one after another, unloading tractors, canned food, and new vehicles by the thousands. Railway lines ran past in endless patterns, moving freight cars with mathematical precision. The POW camps themselves were clean, efficient, and governed by rules the Italians barely understood. To their astonishment, American guards often spoke politely, sometimes sharing coffee or cigarettes. It wasn't generosity, it was procedure, part of a code that treated war as logistics, not vengeance. For the tankers who had once worshipped machines, the revelation was humbling. They had believed power came from steel thickness, from muzzle velocity, from a nation's ability to forge iron. Now they saw that true power came from organization, from a nation where every factory, farmer, and worker was part of the same battle plan. They began to understand that the Sherman wasn't a marvel of design, it was a marvel of production. It was the physical proof that America could turn blueprints into dominance faster than any army could resist it. Some Italian officers secretly admired the Sherman's simplicity. The engines could be swapped in hours, the suspension standardized, the parts interchangeable across continents. One captured lieutenant later wrote that the Americans built tanks as if they were toys, simple, replaceable, unstoppable. His words weren't ridicule but recognition. In the M1340, every component felt handcrafted, precious, irreplaceable, which made every loss tragic. In the Sherman, nothing was precious because everything was plentiful. By late 1943, as Italy itself teetered on the edge of surrender, these prisoners had already grasped what their generals had not. The war had become a test of systems, not spirit. And for all the courage they'd shown in the desert, courage could not repair an engine, could not weld armor, could not move a supply train across an ocean. For the men who had fought in the sand, defeat had already revealed its deeper truth. They hadn't lost to better soldiers, but to a better machine of men. In the POW camps scattered across Texas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska, Italian tankers slowly began to see another war unfold, one of production and principle. Every day they labored on farms, built fences, or repaired machinery under the open skies. They were paid small wages, given time off, even allowed to write letters home. For men who had been taught that the enemy was barbaric and mechanical, this quiet order was disarming. America was fighting a total war, yet life here felt abundant. Cafeterias never ran out of food, civilians drove new trucks, and newspapers spoke openly about the war's progress. To the prisoners, it seemed as if democracy itself was a factory, one that produced both freedom and power. Some of the tankers, especially those from technical backgrounds, studied what they saw. They noticed the way American farmers used tractors identical in design to tank engines, how spare parts were stacked and cataloged like ammunition, how young workers in overalls spoke of the war effort as if they were part of a single machine. It was a world without hierarchy, a nation where the factory worker mattered as much as the general. And in that realization, many Italians understood that the strength behind the Sherman tank wasn't its armor, it was the society that built it. Letters captured from the front and passed among prisoners told stories of Italy's collapse, fuel shortages, strikes, bombed-out factories, and leaders still clinging to delusions of pride. The contrast gnawed at them. Here in captivity, they were well fed, medically treated, and part of an efficient routine. At home, their families starved under air raids. What had begun as humiliation turned into introspection. The same men who once cursed the invincible Shermans now debated how their own nation could ever hope to rebuild if it did not learn from what they were witnessing firsthand. When Italy signed the armistice in 1943, many of these men faced a choice: remain loyal to a lost cause or join the new Italian service units to help the Allies. Thousands volunteered. They became mechanics, cooks, transport drivers, still wearing their old uniforms, but now working for the system that had defeated them. It was not betrayal, it was survival and perhaps redemption. These former tankers helped harvest crops for American soldiers overseas, built roads, and even maintained the same Sherman tanks that once crushed their divisions. Each day reinforced the lesson: America's strength was not born from cruelty or conquest, but from cooperation. Even in war, it organized rather than destroyed. The Italian prisoners, once proud warriors of an industrial dream that failed, were now cogs in a machine that actually worked, and for many, that realization reshaped their entire understanding of what power truly meant. When the war finally began to turn, word of Italy's surrender and Mussolini's downfall spread quickly through the camps. Some prisoners cheered, others wept. They had fought for a vision of national pride, and now that vision lay in ruins. Yet even in defeat, a strange sense of clarity emerged. Many Italian tankers realized that their country's weakness had never been its soldiers, it had been its foundation. The factories at home were outdated, the leadership corrupt, the industry fragmented. They had gone to war in tanks built by outdated doctrines, against a nation that could replace entire divisions faster than Italy could replace a single company. In 1944, as Allied forces pushed through Italy, a few thousand Italian POWs were given the chance to return home under new allegiance. They traveled by train through the American heartland, crossing cities that stretched for miles: Chicago, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, each one humming with the same energy they had glimpsed in the camps. Smoke rose from steel mills, shipyards roared day and night, and everywhere they looked, production seemed limitless. These were not cities ruled by fear or propaganda, but by efficiency and faith in work itself. To men who had fought in machines that failed them, it was like witnessing the anatomy of victory. They began to understand that the Sherman tank wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of a civilization that believed in progress over perfection. American tanks were not the best on paper. Heavier German Tigers could crush them, faster British Cromwells could outrun them, but none could match their numbers or the relentless rhythm of their creation. The M4 was a lesson in pragmatism: good enough, mass-produced, constantly improved. It reflected an American mindset that valued adaptability over arrogance, production over pride. In contrast, Italy's tanks were designed with old-world craftsmanship. Rivets instead of welds, intricate parts instead of standard ones. They looked elegant in blueprints but fragile in battle. Italian officers had once boasted of their machine's beauty, but beauty could not withstand a 75 shell. In the end, war had revealed a brutal truth: efficiency was the new artistry. By 1945, as the war neared its end, thousands of these former tankers worked on American farms or in support units under the new Italian co-belligerent banner. They wore Allied patches, maintained jeeps, loaded cargo ships, and watched the war they once fought unravel from the opposite side. They weren't proud, but they were wiser. They had seen the inside of both worlds, one that glorified ideology and one that trusted industry. And as victory loomed, many wrote home about what they'd learned. They didn't speak of shame or resentment, but of possibility, of rebuilding Italy not through slogans, but through systems. They had fought inside tanks that represented failure. Now they dreamed of factories that could build something enduring, not for conquest, but for creation. When the war finally ended in 1945, the surviving Italian tankers returned home to a country unrecognizable. Cities lay in rubble, factories gutted, railways twisted like broken bones. Yet amid the ruins, they carried with them the most unexpected inheritance of war: the knowledge of how modern power truly worked. In the American system, they had witnessed everything connected: factory to field, mechanic to soldier, machine to nation. It was a vision far removed from the hollow propaganda of fascist glory, and for many of those who had once served inside the fragile shells of M1340s, that knowledge became a blueprint for Italy's rebirth. They came home with stories that sounded almost mythical: how American assembly lines could turn out 1,000 tanks a month, how every Sherman part could fit any other Sherman built anywhere in the world, how even prisoners of war were treated with structure and purpose. Their families, weary from bombing and hunger, could barely comprehend it, yet these stories spread quietly through workshops and reconstruction offices. Engineers, mechanics, and former officers began to imagine a new Italy, one not built on grand speeches but on practical cooperation. Some of the men who once fought against the Shermans found themselves now working on tractors, trucks, and rail cars designed under American supervision. The same mechanical logic that had once defeated them now became their teacher. American engineers sent by the Marshall Plan taught standardized production. Italians adapted it with characteristic creativity. Within a decade, the same nation that once produced obsolete tanks was exporting cars, typewriters, and industrial tools across Europe. The transformation was not just economic, it was cultural. Italy had learned painfully that freedom of thought and efficiency of system were two sides of the same victory. Looking back years later, many veterans admitted that their defeat had given them perspective no victory could. They remembered the smell of oil and dust inside those old tanks, the helplessness of firing shells that bounced like pebbles, the shock of seeing enemy tanks repaired faster than theirs could be fueled. They remembered kindness from the guards who shared coffee, the hum of trains that never stopped, the factories that never slept. What began as humiliation had become understanding. In the final reckoning, the Italian tankers had not simply lost a war, they had witnessed the birth of a new world. The Sherman tank, clumsy and imperfect, had become more than a weapon. It was a moving emblem of an idea. That strength lies in unity, not grandeur, in systems, not slogans. And when these men helped rebuild their homeland from the ashes, they carried that idea with them. The tank that once crushed them had, in its own way, taught them how to stand again.